Welcome to the show. I am your host, Dan O'Donnell, and the Veterans Affairs scandal is still a big deal, even after President Obama essentially fired VA Secretary Eric Shinseki. My first guest is the founder and CEO of the veterans group Homeward Deployed. She's affectionately known as the Veteran Lady. She is Gretchen Martens. Gretchen, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me on your show.
So Eric Shinseki resigned. That really doesn't change a whole lot with what's going on and what has been going on for decades with respect to VA healthcare systems, does it?
I wish I could say it does, but the problems are so huge, so systemic, and they go back almost to the founding of the VA. There hasn't been a decade where there hasn't been a VA scandal and a breakdown in the providing of services to veterans. So while he's out, we're still left with a huge mess to try to figure out and how we take care of our veterans coming home.
So why has this been so difficult for the VA to figure out? It sounds as though this has been going on for 40 years now.
Absolutely, and part of it, well, it's hard to defend Shinseki or the White House. It is a very large system dealing with health care for 8 million people, many of whom have more severe needs. So it's very hard to manage and run a system of that size. I think, though, given that it's a system of people who are largely military, there's a surprising lack of accountability and systems to make sure that we don't have the kind of breakdowns that we've seen come out in the press over the past month.
Now, is this a function of maybe this department simply being too large, the bureaucracy being too unwieldy to control? Because the VA, the Department of Veterans Affairs, if I'm not mistaken, is the second largest behind only the Defense Department in the entire federal government.
Exactly, and the point that someone made to me who is a retired admiral, she said, if you look at the healthcare system for active duty service members, it functions very, very well. But at any given time, they're roughly taking care of about 1 million people. So the VA, in terms of people served, is 8 times as big as our Department of Defense health systems for active duty service personnel.
So how can that be remedied? Is there a way to remedy that?
Well, there are some examples. I know that the North Dallas VA system actually passed their audit. They do have issues that they're still dealing with wait times and things like that. But, that is a model of a place that was dealing effectively with their wait times and not cooking the books. But I think that we're going to have to really think about maybe something more along the lines of public-private partnerships, of looking at the VA as a primary system. But if that primary system isn't going to work, then how else can we get these veterans the health care that they need, that they deserve, and that we've promised them as an American people?
Is that to you the worst part about this, that we're sort of not living up to our end of the bargain, that these men and women served their country and the implicit promise was that they would be taken care of? In fact, the explicit promise was that they'd be taken care of, but it's very clear that they haven't been.
Absolutely, and particularly when you look at the Phoenix VA hospital's post-deployment clinic. So that was a clinic for the guys and gals coming back now. We had people with post-traumatic stress so severe that they really weren't functioning on a day-to-day basis. People that had been blown up by IEDs waiting 9 months for care. And these are human beings. They have families. They have children. They have parents that are worried about them. And to me, it's just morally and ethically not right.
Gretchen Martens is the Veteran Lady. She's the founder and CEO of Homeward Deployed. You can find out more about her work at theveteranlady.com. Now, I want to talk about these secret waiting lists. The fact that it appears as though this was a widespread thing. In the private sector, that's called fraud, is it not?
Well, it is, and that's where we're seeing, these incidents are being referred to the Justice Department. They're looking at criminal prosecutions, and that's been one of the things that for me has been so upsetting from the beginning. If this were a civilian hospital, the head of that hospital would have been immediately removed. they would have been under criminal investigation, and we would have just seen much quicker action. And here we are talking about our veterans, and everything seemed to move at a snail's pace, and it took a considerable length of time before Shinseki was encouraged to resign.
It seems as though Shinseki has been used as a human shield, if you were. And I know the house in Phoenix was essentially cleaned, but President Obama himself said that this was a widespread systemic issue. To what extent do you think that the White House and the VA at large have used Shinseki's forced resignation as a sort of cover, as a sort of way to say, okay, we've got the problem fixed?
Well, I think they have, and if you remember back to the press conference that Obama had when Shinseki resigned, it's like, oh my gosh, we didn't know we had all of these problems with the computer system. We knew about those problems years ago. So it really is, in my perspective, a CYA kind of maneuver, not to mention the fact that when Obama was first running for office, when he was running for re-election, in a wide number of speeches, he kept saying, that the VA is a primary focus for us. It's a primary focus. Well, if something were my primary focus and I wanted to see action, I'd want regular reports. I'd want metrics. I would kind of get down in the trenches to make sure that the change I was committed to seeing was actually happening. And he didn't do that. And it's not entirely Eric Shinseki's fault.
Is there
responsibility?
Is there plausible deniability for the president here? I mean, do you believe that he really didn't know what was going on since, as you put it, this has been going on for so long?
Well, it's almost like the Iran-Contra scandal. Was it better that Reagan knew and did nothing, or that he didn't know? I find it very hard to believe that Obama had no clue about any of this, especially when he kept saying this was such a priority. But that's actually a military leadership, a military culture thing. You take a fall for the commander-in-chief or your leader. And so at a certain level, I think that probably Eric Shinseki, as a retired four-star general, took the fall for the president. But I think that people aren't really buying that this time around.
No, it almost seems as though we've been through this so many times before with so many different Obama administration scandals. I mean, from Fast and Furious to the IRS to the NSA to Benghazi to all of this. Do you think that this, though, because it involves America's veterans, do you think this is more damaging politically and kind of, I don't want to say, I don't want to reduce it to politics, but do you think it hits closer to home to people that even if you're not a veteran yourself or you don't have a veteran in your immediate family, that we can instantly say, hey, this is wrong. And as Americans, we're more outraged by this than, say, the IRS targeting conservative groups?
I think so. And it's also almost a myth that we have, and the military perpetrates this. Oh, we're the 1%, we're the 1%. Well, at any given time in today's current events, 1% of America's population serve as active duty service members. But when you look at 3 million some post 9/11 veterans, we have over 23 million veterans of all wars in this country. And you start to add in spouses and children and siblings. And, we're really talking about at least half of our population that in some way is directly related to a veteran or works closely with a veteran or owns a business with a veteran or goes to church with a veteran. So I think that this hits much closer because for most of us, we know somebody, and even if it's not a close relation, it might be my neighbor's son, or I go to church with this guy and his nephew is in the military. I think it hits much closer to home and who we are as real people, and imagining the suffering that our own country has put our veterans through.
Right. Gretchen Martens is the veteran lady. She is the founder and CEO of HomewardDeployed.com. You mentioned the post 9/11 veterans. Everybody who signed up and all of the veterans after the 9/11 attacks. Is there something then to that? It's sort of the Obama supporters, the liberal talking points were sort of, well, President Bush had these 2 wars, and all of a sudden we've got so many more veterans, the system couldn't handle it. Is there something to that, or is that just sort of a way to give President Obama some political cover?
I think it's both and. I mean, I try not to play politics, and I think there's no point in finger pointing, but, let's not forget that it was President Obama that ordered the surge. And granted, that may have been supported by the military, but he was the president responsible for that. He could have said no, or let's look at alternatives. So I don't think that lets him off the hook by pointing the finger at George Bush. And the other piece of it that many people are not aware of is that we have changed, and I won't go way down this rabbit hole, but the rules or the medical findings around exposure to Agent Orange. So what we're seeing is a lot of Vietnam veterans who had Agent Orange exposure who are now have Parkinson's, or they have ALS, or they have diabetes, who are now eligible for benefits that they weren't eligible for, 30 years ago when my dad was getting out of the Army after having been in Vietnam. So we're seeing kind of a double whammy for the VA. It doesn't excuse their poor performance, but it does speak to the escalating pressures that they're on. And then there's the economy, and we're seeing a lot of Vietnam-era veterans, Gulf War veterans, who never got their benefits because they had private health insurance, who now don't, and they're looking to the VA for care because they have nowhere else to go.
How do you see this resolving itself, or will it resolve itself?
It will resolve itself to a fashion. I think that we'll make changes. I'm skeptical that we're ever really going to be willing to do the hard work that's going to make the VA an effective system. And what I also found very concerning back when Obama had his press conference and announced that Shinseki was resigning is the thing, well, it's going to cost more money. We don't know how much. We're going to have to find the money. Well, the VA already has a budget of $164 billion a year, and they haven't managed that money well. There's gigantic amounts of waste, not only in the VA, but many federal systems. So to just throw money at it is going to throw good money after bad. I worry about that without actually solving the problems.
What do you think is the single best thing that the federal government can do to actually help?
I think, it's hard to narrow it down to one, but I think to work more with public-private partnerships, to look to private physicians, and maybe actually admitting that they have a mess on their hands and saying, you know what, we're not going to reinvent the VA quick enough, particularly for all these young guys and gals coming back from our recent wars, and we're going to need to turn to our community systems for help to make sure that they're cared for. Because if we don't care for them now, pay now or pay later, but we will pay. Make no mistake about that. So will they have the maturity and the commitment to really helping these guys and gals, to admitting that they have a mess on their hands they don't know how to solve, and asking for help from non-federal partners.
Gretchen Martens is the founder and CEO of Homeward Deployed, known as the Veteran Lady. Her website, theveteranlady.com. Gretchen, thank you as always. Always do appreciate your perspective on this ongoing scandal that shows no sign of abating, even in a post-Shinseki VA. Thanks so much.
Thank you.